And now I'd like to introduce our speaker, Ellen Chisa. Ellen is a founder in residence at Bolstart Ventures, where she invests and supports portfolio companies. Previously, she was a co-founder and CEO of Dark, a programming language, and a VP of product at Lola. Ellen holds a Bachelor of Science in Electrical and Computer Engineering from Allen College and an MBA from Harvard Business School. I am personally excited to introduce Ellen. We met back in 2013 when I was a student at Startup Institute New York, where Ellen taught classes on product and design. I encourage you all to check out Ellen's website and follow Ellen on Twitter. Let's welcome Ellen by giving her a warm round of applause. Ellen, take it away.
I'm super excited to be here today. My personal background, I really love helping people make things, however that happens to go or through whatever format that is. And Olga gave you a little bit of this, but I originally studied engineering for undergrad at a place called Olin, but I mostly took design classes there. And then after college, continued that by taking some more classes in the HCD program at UW, have worked on a bunch of tools that help people make things at Microsoft on Office Mobile, then at Kickstarter, working on helping people get capital, at Lola, a travel company in Boston that maybe some of you have heard of, and then finally starting a programming language called Dark. Had a brief interlude with going to business school, mostly because I'd always really enjoyed making things that I thought had value and substance and would matter, but I didn't always have a sense of how business models should correspond to what we were building and how to capture value that we were creating effectively. And I kind of wanted a sense for what everyone else was thinking about, which is kind of what we're going to talk about today too. And then as part of that, I've really cared about getting money into the right places to be effective through some work with the Awesome Foundation, which is an organization that just gives grants, no strings attached to people who are working on cool projects. Then at Kickstarter, right at the time that I met Olga, as a personal angel investor. So if any of you are ever thinking about starting companies, I do angel invest. And then as an institutional investor in my current role at Bolstart, where we back mostly developer tooling and enterprise companies. But I really like designers as founders. So again, if you're starting a company, I'm happy to chat. One side effect I've kind of found through having this career so far is that I've had a lot of friends who've been UX people and designers and PMs that I've gotten to work with, and engineers too, who usually come to me kind of with their complaints about what leadership is doing that they don't get, or about this new company strategy, or just about like, why doesn't this thing work? So I'm kind of everyone's go-to career counselor in that regard. And so today, the frame that I kind of wanted to give us as we think about how to get that seat at the table is taking our top complaints and turning those into actionable things we can do. So I'm going to give you the top 5 complaints I hear from my friends in design. These are usually prefaced with statements like, I love my job, but, or this job would be great if I could focus on the right thing, but, or I came because I really believe in this, but. And so if I go through these 5 and you've never said one of them, I guess I give you permission to go, but I also hope that maybe you'll either learn something from it, or one of your mentees will come to you with one of these complaints and I'll give you another potential way to think about it. If I also have missed any that you feel like people say a lot, I would love to hear them and kind of add and grow over time as well. So here's the 5. First, everyone only cares about finance. This sometimes also comes up as everyone only cares about making money, or I have some friends where it comes up as, I wish we didn't have to do capitalism, but like some flavor of everyone only cares about finance. This one I've felt myself many a time. I keep getting asked to drop everything long-term to just hack something together to close one deal. Happens more in B2B scenarios, but even when I was at Kickstarter, it would sometimes happen where we'd have an event or a special project and whoever I was working with would be like, I really want to keep working on our long-term project, but I just got asked to drop this. Third, no one takes me seriously when I bring up real user problems. 4, people just want me to push pixels. This is usually accompanied with, that's not even the fun part of my job, or people like don't seem to get everything I do that matters. It's under the hood. They just want me to make this nice UI for them. And then probably the most common I don't get brought into the process early enough when we're building things, and I can't do the best job of doing my job. This is usually why people are advocating for their seat at the table. They want to be brought in earlier and be able to do this. So we're going to do 2 things for each of these 5 problems. The first one is we're going to flip the script around. And so I don't want anyone to take this as like, oh, this is a problem with designers, even though I'm mostly going to give you things that you can use as UX professionals and designers to change. I think this has got to be an effort on both sides, but I'm a big believer in at least owning the part of the work that you can own and doing it to try to get people to be there with you, and they're not always going to. And so when I think of flip the script, one of the leaderships I really like is the 15 Commitments of Conscious Leadership. But in that book, one of the 10 principles is kind of this idea that whenever I'm telling myself a story about something, like they're not listening to me, I can flip it around and say the other story for the other person. And so our flip the script on these 5 problems isn't going to be a direct opposite, but it's going to be another thing that you can think when you start having that thought. This is the cover of the book, if anyone wants to find it. I actually quite like all 15 of these principles. And then the second part of this that we're going to do is we're going to think about tools we can use when we're in these 5 situations to be more effective. And that's not that we're going to learn a whole new set of things today. I'm going to try to show where the tools that you already have as designers and UX people can fit in to each of those situations. Things like paying attention to the context you're in, or having empathy with the people you're working with, or thinking through user interviews or ethnography. But the sorts of things we do all the time, just applied in a different space. So with that, let's start with the first one. Everyone only cares about finance. So I'm going to ask you to bear with me for a minute here. We're going to do a little bit of Finance 101. I would guess that some of you probably have done this before, but I know a lot of my friends haven't, and I think it's important. The good news is, with doing a little bit of Finance 101 to build this empathy and context, we're only going to talk about 3 numbers. We're going to talk about valuation, multiples, and revenue. And if you're thinking about this, it's actually only 2 numbers. You can derive the 3rd number from 2 of these numbers, so not too much math. Okay, so valuation. You usually see this if you look up a public company. It's often called the market capitalization, but it's the idea of how much the total company is worth. The alternative for a private company, since I'm sure some of you are at startups, and it's the world I usually live in. This is one I pulled last week. Chief is a network designed to help businesswomen rise into more power, so I thought it was appropriate here. They raised a $100 million Series B, and that means the valuation is at 1.1 billion. And so the thing about these numbers is, I think most of the time it kind of feels like someone just waved their hand around and then picked an arbitrary number, especially for these private valuations where an investor has decided. And I think the best thing I got out of going to business school was to figure out that these numbers are actually real, and there's a bunch of math you can go through to get them. So just to kind of give you an idea, I don't think you should spend a bunch of time running through these models to figure it out, but just so you've heard one person talk about it once, there are 3 primary financial statements that companies have. One is called the balance sheet, which is basically what are the assets you have and what are the liabilities you have. The more interesting one is usually the income statement, which shows how much money you're making over time. The 3rd one is a statement of free cash flows, which you can basically use to, and you usually have to build out the model yourself. Companies don't disclose them, but it can basically just show if a company is liquid or not. But if you have the income statement, the way these valuations tend to get created is they look at the amount of income a company is going to have over time. And you usually do this by the amount of profit that's going to be made, which is why it comes from the income statement. And then people build out a really simple model. It's called a discounted cash flow. But so if you assume that this year you're going to make $10 million and your company will make $10 million in perpetuity, your other option would be modeling it up and saying you're going to make slightly more each year. Then basically what happens is every year in the future, you're not going to have the money. You just discount it by some factor, usually about 15%. And then the company gets valued as the sum of all of those numbers over time into infinity. You usually stop after 10 to 15 years. And so in our hypothetical company that only has $10 million of income per year, it's going to be worth about $60 million. So this, when I learned it, made me feel a lot better, just from the perspective of this number isn't completely made up. It's basically saying the things that we do in the product that get people to buy it actually are impacting how much money we'll make, next year and 5 years down the line, because we want to do the right things by our users. And that's what's going to help do this. But I felt a little bit better about it not being completely arbitrary. The bad news about this, as much as it's really nice to make these models, and they are one of the most robust ways to analyze a company, most finance professionals and investment bankers who are, say, analyzing an individual stock in a bank don't work off of this. They instead work off of the idea of a multiple. And so this is actually kind of helpful if you're thinking about taking a new job. You can look at this number. But so the idea of a multiple is that you assume that any company at steady state is going to make about the same amount of money as other businesses in the industry. And so you'll look at a ratio between either profit or revenue, or you can pick a cost number if you want to look at a margin, and the end value. So this varies by industry. Grocery stores tend to have pretty low revenue multiples, 0.1 to 0.5x, because they have such low margin. On the other hand, a lot of us probably work in high technology where the multiples tend to be 10 to 100x. If a company has a lower multiple, it usually means that the industry thinks it's undervalued and you should, it's probably a better buy. If it has a higher multiple, it probably means it's less attractive of a position. Or if it's a very high number, it might be that really high growth is expected. So depending on the multiple, you can kind of see, is the number fairly valuing the company today, or are you going to really have to grow into that number? Okay. And so that gets us to the one that's actually probably, yes. So the way you look at this, if you're looking at a public stock, it'll be like the price to earnings ratio usually. And if you think about multiples in private companies and how this will come up, if you say work at a Series B startup, these are all pretty reasonable numbers for one, and you make $5 million a year and you're only valued at $50 million, it's a 10x multiple. This is super reasonable. It's actually quite low, which probably means you'll either be raising money again soon, or for some reason your company is undervalued. But if you are only making $500,000 a year and you're valued at that same number, you'd have a 100x multiple. And so you're kind of in a different position where you really need to grow into the valuation you've already been granted. And then the last one, I don't know if anyone saw what unfortunately happened with Fast last week when they basically, it was a company, they'd raised a ton of money. And so in the reported numbers, which the founder has contested, but if you assume they're somewhere in this ballpark, they were only making $600,000 last year, but they had been already valued at $500 million. So they're at an 833x multiple. And so you can see how they set themselves up at that multiple for having a giant dream and being able to get there really fast, which is probably part of what led to their issue with being able to fundraise in the current market. And so you can see these dynamics. A company is in a very different position for getting more cash, kind of depending where in this multiple stack they're sitting at. And so if you want to move this, the number you have to move is revenue. So that's the other one I wanted to just touch on briefly. Again, I think it's not the most of us in UX would rather think about the users and what we're building and generating value in a little bit more of a subjective way. But for the revenue side of it, what ends up happening is revenue gets reported quarterly by fiscal year. I think the most interesting thing about revenue is it's fraud if you book it wrong. And so I think for a lot of us, if we have a work item that we're going to do on Tuesday, and then we go chat with someone and we're like, it's only going to be done until Wednesday, it's no big deal. It's basically the same thing. If someone has a deal and they sent out the paperwork and it was supposed to close on Tuesday and the quarter happens to turn over on Wednesday, and they're like, it was mostly done on Tuesday, and they record it that way accounting wise, that is extremely illegal. And so there's a lot of sensitivity around revenue numbers. The other three numbers that I think are quite helpful to think about for everyone in a company, just to kind of have as context in your head going to the multiples part, people usually either talk about monthly recurring revenue, so how much revenue you have coming in every month, or annual recurring revenue, how much you have coming in every year. These numbers you'll see often in all hands. I'm sure some of you have. And then the other one that might be handy to have is ACV, or average contract value, which just gives you an idea of how big your customers are. And so the reason I give you all of this is when you think about what's happening in your company, one of the big drivers of the overall strategy for the team gets set in the quarterly board meetings. So quarterly board meetings, they're usually 3 hours once per quarter, as you would guess, because I said quarterly. And the people who are in the table at this meeting are usually the founders or CEO of the company, possibly executives who are brought in to share specifically how their strategy is or isn't supporting the current goals of the company. Investors, so people like me right now with most of the companies I work with, I'm the only investor in their board meeting because I start at seed stage, so really early, but over time we'll add more investors. And then independents. And so the mix shifts. The closer you are to being a public company, the more independence you have and the fewer investors you usually have on the board. And so during this, since you only have 3 hours once per quarter, and you're trying to align a whole bunch of disparate people, most of whom aren't in the experience of being in the company every single day and seeing the actual operational challenges, what tends to happen is you have to have something to align around. And so typically the CEO will do like a 10-minute intro about their subjective idea of how the company is doing. And that will be immediately followed by, this is what the revenue number is right now. And like, these are the things that have made us either miss or hit our goal. And then everyone else in that room is kind of designed to talk about what their process is. So someone in sales will talk about how the sales team is doing and if they're hitting quotas, which we'll talk about in a little bit. And if someone from design or product is there, I'd expect that they would talk about, say, the idea of like the next 3 key projects on the roadmap, but never anything more detailed that all of us would like be thinking about in the day-to-day as we're building. So keeping it super high level and always tying those things back to the revenue number. And so when people come to you and kind of are pushing on this finance number, that's why they're doing it. It's because there's this big alignment system that is based on the common language we can all speak is around money, because the salesperson can't impact the design and you can't necessarily impact how many sales someone is closing. And so it gives one thing for alignment. And the other reason that this is what gets focused on is that there are a lot of consequences of not hitting this number. So if you don't hit this number, fundamentally, if you've ever raised money, like we were talking about with the multiples, to some extent, you've already broken a promise by not raising it. It's like the same as when like a sprint deadline slips or like a feature deadline slips. It's like you've missed a big commitment. It's a big deal. And everyone's kind of going, hey, you promised this thing. It also can be really like hard on the team from a people standpoint. I think probably many of us have been through this. But people's effective compensation falls because if you're a public company and you miss the revenue number, the stock price falls and that impacts people's compensation. And if you're a private company and your revenue number falls, you're not necessarily, you're gonna have to raise sooner. Oh, you'll raise at less good of a price, so everyone will take more dilution. So functionally, everyone gets paid less. Anyone who's in that room who's missed commitments, if it's a big enough miss, like they're getting fired. So there's like a lot of personal pressure. And there's possible layoffs to get the expenses to match the revenue. And then the worst case scenario, like we just saw with Fast, is that the company is failing. And so the reason I bring this up is I think a lot of times, at least conversations I've had before, if you come in and you're like, oh, well, like we could hit the revenue number by doing this thing that's not as good, but like if we make it, we're going to have a less good user experience. The calculus someone who's sitting in that board meeting is making is like, okay, but if I have a slightly bad experience now, the worst case scenario is I mix the revenue number next month. And if I miss it this month, all this stuff happens now. So it's like a little bit of putting off the problem, but the like calculus that's happening isn't about dollars compared to experience. It's about, I might have to fire people compared to experience. And I think it obviously depends on where the company is sitting, but I think having this in mind can be really helpful. And so I would consider flipping the script of when you like start getting the feeling of everyone only cares about finance or everyone only cares about revenue, thinking of it instead as the financial number is a lagging indicator of everyone's work. Whatever you do in the product is eventually going to impact that number, but it's not going to impact that number for like however long in the future. And so I think about how you can have the conversation in that context, because they're going to be sticking on that anyway. So then second one. This is very similar, so I wanted to put them together. I keep getting asked to drop everything to hack something together to close one deal. Some of you probably know this if you've talked with your coworkers before about how they're compensated, but just to give you an idea, most salespeople are compensated such that I would say at least a third of their compensation is variable. I just pulled some average Boston numbers. It's going to vary company by company. But most of the time, I would say it's a third to half of sales compensation is based on closing every single deal. And so, I mean, even for myself, if someone told me they were going to pay me twice as much if all my specs were twice as many pages, I would be completely incentivized to just write more and more and pay more pages no matter what I did. And so the same way, salespeople, they're incentivized to just close more and more and more deals no matter what, because it's going to impact their personal bottom line, which I think it's nice as PMs and designers that we don't have this experience. And so since they're coming to you kind of with this idea, I like to give the idea that you should start asking them more questions about the deal and using a little bit about what we just talked about finance to figure out, is everything worth dropping for this one or not? Because I don't think we should be dropping for every single deal that comes up that we want to close. And so I would think through a bunch of different questions, but I'll pull a couple of these for examples. So one is like, we talked about how revenue books by quarter. I would think about, when is the quarter going to end? If you can figure out what your company's fiscal year is, someone should be willing to tell you. And then if the deal is likely to meaningfully impact the quarter. One way to assess that is, how big is the deal? So like, if your company has an ACV, average contract value, of $100,000, and someone's asking you to like drop everything to close a $5,000 deal, it's probably not going to move the needle. You're not going to get much credit for dropping to do that work. You get why the salesperson is advocating because of how their compensation structure works, but it doesn't really make sense. On the other hand, if someone comes and says like, I need you to drop everything, we're trying to move up market, this is going to be our first $500,000 a year deal, we promise we get it in this quarter, this is going to be 1/6 of our revenue, that's something that makes more sense. Or if it's someone from a new industry and you're trying to get like make a move into that new industry, that's like another way. So if the logo is particularly important. And so when someone's coming to you and saying like, you have to drop everything, this thing is important, I would take the time and like ask and understand the context, because they're going to be ones that are worth dropping it for and ones that aren't worth dropping it for. And that's a tool all of you already have from talking to users all the time. So for this one, I would think of it, instead of, I keep getting asked to drop everything to hack something together to close one deal, it's honestly just, my coworkers don't get paid as much if we don't sign certain deals. This doesn't mean you have to go out of your way and do it every single time, but that's why they're always going to ask. I think I would always ask for that if that was what people set me up to do. And so I would encourage you to add that strategic level of, should we be doing it or not? And I think that'll get you a lot of credibility, both with your coworkers and hopefully also get you more time back. Third one, no one takes me seriously when I bring up real user problems. This was probably my personal one that I found the most frustrating when I was still working in product and UX. So I wanted to pull out an example. I think probably many of you are familiar with this website. It used to be called Dark Patterns, and now it's called Deceptive Design. But I bet many of you have had the experience of like, say an exec comes in and goes, I want to up subscription revenue. Therefore, we're going to default people into subscription revenue every time they buy something. And we're going to try to like use every cognitive trick in the book to get them to always do it. And you're kind of thinking, I don't want to do that because it's dark pattern or it's deceptive design. This isn't the right thing for the person. And so what I encourage you to do in this case, and I know we do this with users all the time too, when we think about mapping how we are talking with them, is to advocate back to the exec in their own language. These conversations seem like they go the worst, where exec goes, I want to make more money, and designer goes, that's bad design, because there's nowhere really to connect on it. It's sort of like, technically you don't want to, like, you do want to make more money and you don't want to use bad design, but there's like no traction to figure out how to weigh out between the two. And so what I encourage and what I usually try to do with these now is try to think of as many options as possible, many other options as possible that might help solve the exec's problem in a different way. And this is like a little bit science and a little bit art. But I try to just like write them all down first before I go into context, so I can kind of feel the person out and think about what might influence them the best. But it could be, in this like fake subscription example, you don't want them to buy something by mistake and return it, because that's going to impact operations. And so if that exec is also thinking about the cost of operations and how much effort it would be to have a big return desk, that might be a lot more effective than it's bad design. Or easier, maybe, I don't want the user to call into service. So if the exec also cares about like this line item of every time someone calls support, we're making this much money, or like we're losing this much money and having to pay this many people, thinking about like, okay, so many of our subscription call-ins are about this specific problem, we shouldn't do it because it's going to make that worse. Or it could be the user doesn't actually want to subscribe to this product and they might leave a bad review. this could work on someone who is tracking referral scores or NPS or some other type of customer happiness. It could be that the user, if this happens, not only won't subscribe, they'll cancel their subscription, and then they won't ever buy an individual purchase again. So could it show up at a retention number? Or my personal favorite is always, there might be a better way to achieve the goal the executive is talking to, even though they came with kind of a weird specific do this thing that shouldn't happen. And so once I kind of get a list of things like this, I'll try to go back and figure out which part of the business it impacts or which number. So these are the ones we just pulled out. Other ones that are pretty common are the idea of how much is the cost of acquisition, or is there something we could do around product-led growth, or is there something like, do we talk about users or do we talk about customers? Just figure out a way to talk about the language in a way the executive will hear and see you as like a peer who is working on solving this challenge with them, rather than someone who's just being like, nope, we can't do that because it's bad design. Bringing in the broader perspective will like help get that conversation going. I'm not going to say they won't still make it happen occasionally, but I think it's a better way. And then when you find the one that they care about, you can then say something along the lines of, I think there are other better options. Can we look at them? And kind of give them the option to opt in. And if they say no, that tells you something else. That tells you maybe that they kind of made up the reason why they were doing the thing and they've already decided it for some other. So I would just file it as data. But most of the time, I found that this like tends to get under the problem and avoid a lot of strife. So I would try to flip it from no one takes me seriously when I bring up real user problems, just a little bit, which is to be the best advocate, I have to translate user problems into a language execs understand. Like you're still sharing the same user problems. It's just, you're a little bit of a better advocate when you don't just advocate directly, when you like add a little bit of a translation layer in between. Fourth one, last one will be quick too. People just want me to push pixels. Okay, so this one, I think the really important thing is to own your own time and power. I think when we're in rooms with, and I'm not a visual designer, you can tell from the slides, I am really bad at this. And so when you're in a room with a bunch of people who can actually do nice pixels and can push pixels, like, yes, everyone in that room agrees that that's not the important thing. And there's like a lot more depth and thought that goes into doing design. But for the rest of us, when we look at a whiteboard like this, it's kind of like, oh, like I can draw a whiteboard, I can like work out some flows, maybe not as well, but the idea in your head is like, oh, this isn't a shippable thing. We're just trying it out. It's going to be fine. I can play with this myself. In contrast to when you like look at actual visual mocks, you're like, oh, I could ship this. And so I think there's this idea of when you're in a room with a bunch of people who can do it, what you're going to be rewarded for is the things that the in-group cares about. And so like if you're in a room with a bunch of people who value UX already, of course, like being able to work things out gracefully and with elegance, like that's going to be more top of mind. But when you're in a room with other people, like an analyst probably wouldn't go into a room and say that SQL isn't the fun part of their job, even though it's not. Like PMs wouldn't usually go into a room and be like, I don't like doing tickets. Like engineers don't like say, I don't want to write code. And I think it's because when you're in that mixed group, like you can own that you are good at this unique thing that no one else in the room can do. And so I think the key here is to realize that. Another framework, just bring back the 15 commitments of conscious leadership, is that you can kind of think of like, what zone are you playing in? And so I would say that most designers, most UX designers wouldn't say that doing the visual design is in their zone of genius, where they love it so much it doesn't feel like work, or it's the like highest time value thing. But I would say most designers that I have worked with, at the very least, are in excellent, where they can do visual design better than just about anybody else who's in that company. And so I think that recognition that that skill is there and it's something useful, you can use that to get things done. You can use this to say, oh, this visual design would be better if I was brought in earlier to this process, or, oh, in this visual design, I had to like go back and make these other tweaks that we could have considered more upfront. And so I would definitely rely on that of like, it is a thing that you have uniquely that other people don't have. And so it's basically the reframe from people just want me to push pixels to I'm the only one who can do visual design. And this reframe kind of just gives you a thing to hold on to in addition to everything else you're trying to get. So last one, and then we'll conclude, and I'm happy to answer as many questions as people want. I don't get into the process early enough. So hopefully what we have so far from what we've already done, I really hope that by spending a little bit more time thinking on the financial side, you can get a better sense of quarterly priorities and key customers. And I think having that context actually is quite good for getting into the room earlier, because if you tell someone, oh no, I'm not going to do this deal because it's smaller, someone will come back to you next time with a more important deal and you'll get involved. Hopefully fewer interruptions for last minute deals, same thing. So knowing what the key important things are, not getting interrupted with the unimportant things. Less time spent arguing and less emotional tension with stakeholders. No one likes being told this thing is bad design, but everyone really likes being told, hey, I think there's a way I can help you achieve your goal of increasing revenue, or hey, I think I can help you increase your goal of increasing NPS or LTV or whatever it is. So less time spent arguing, more time spent supporting. And those people, when you help them, are going to keep bringing you in. And owning your power from being able to do something unique is also probably going to get people to put you in the room because they're going to start seeing expertise and valuing it. If you've already worked on the first 4 things we've talked about and you are still not in the room, pretty much the only thing you can do is actually ask for direct feedback. Whether people give you the feedback you need or not is going to probably depend on the health of the organization and how open people are with it. One of the things I really like about UX and design is the strong crit culture of being able to separate yourself from your work and say, hey, I made this. What do you think of it directly? And I would approach this idea around process and being in the room the same way, where you're asking, explain what my contribution in the room is, or what you hypothetically think my contribution in the room is, and explain why you're not putting me there to do it, and removing that from yourself. So I think when you hear this, the responses you might get, it could be that they think there are higher priorities for you. It could just be that there are already too many people in the room. It could be that there's too much skill set with other teammates who are already in the room. It could be that at some point you got invited or you had a conversation with the executive who thought the contribution wasn't necessarily valuable, or it could honestly just be a job where this is never going to happen. And I think either way, it's good to know where you stand. And so if you've done the work, like we've talked about, to try to engage a little bit more directly with executives on what they need and try to kind of align and speak in that language, and it's not happening, this is the sort of feedback that you'll have to get from them. And so instead of, if I don't get brought into the process early enough, if I'm still not in that room, I need to ask for feedback on why. So just recap this really quickly. We've talked about a few tools today. Basically, I would say finance is just the context that'll help you align and empathize with all of your coworkers. It's like a translation layer, and it can be used that way. User interviewing skills can help you figure out why a project is urgent or not, and if you should drop it or keep it. You can align your language with what executives are already talking about to get more support for things, even if you're saying the same thing in imagery. You can own the power of being the only person who can do visual design when you're in a mixed room, as opposed to when you're in a room with designers. And when you're not in the room, you've got to ask for direct feedback the same way you would for any actual design you are building. I just wanted to build this out so everyone can have it all at once if they want, but these are the 5 reframes that I would encourage you to think about when you have one of the common complaints. And so with that, I am happy to talk about any of these in more detail, or if you have something else you want to talk about, we can do questions. I think Olga said at the beginning, I'm on Twitter, I'm at Chisa, and I'm also Ellen at BoldStart VC, and I'm happy to talk anytime about this or startups.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Ellen. This was incredibly valuable, and the more we as designers understand about the business, the more impact we can have. So thank you for sharing these actionable tips. And like Ellen said, we are going to open it up to questions. If you have questions, you can post them in the chat and I will read them out loud to Ellen. So we've got a couple of questions here already. First one from Joe: if finance is a lagging indicator, then would product, sales, and customer or user satisfaction be leading indicators?
It would depend, I guess, on what they're leading or lagging. I would definitely say, let me think, user satisfaction would probably lead revenue, I would guess. A lot of the times what you see is when users are happy, they then tend to, we can talk about this, but if you have an average contract size, most companies want those to expand over time. And so I would say user satisfaction would tend to lead expansion for enterprise products. Similarly, I think user satisfaction would tend to lead referrals for consumer products, which is one of the big things. And then product sales, yeah, it roughly translates directly with revenue, but you can get an idea of like, oh, we're having a good quarter this quarter, and that would lead the like final closing of the books just because of how time works.
Awesome. Thanks, Ellen. And then Kara asks if the deck will be shared after the call. We will be sharing the video on YouTube. And Ellen, are you open to us sharing out the deck as well? Cool. Yes. All right. What other questions do folks have? We have one from Carolyn here. Have you ever run into the issue of conveying the value of hiring a design system designer? I work at a smaller design team and we struggle with building out our design system at the same time as our projects.
Yeah, design systems are very interesting. I actually, for a while, was thinking design systems would somehow there would be like the next wave of companies, and that would be the big movement. Because I went for a while like where it seemed like user research was a big wave, and then we had that wave where we wanted everyone to design and be able to write their front end code at the same time. And so like I feel like we get these themes. When I'm thinking about so yes. Okay. So I would say definitely yes, it can be hard to advocate for the value. I would think of it in terms of the person is going to be thinking of it in terms of how many headcount do they have to hire at all. And so people typically will tend to plan headcount at the same time they fundraise. And so when they fundraise, they'll say, we're going to raise $20 million. And with that $20 million, we're going to hire 10 more people in engineering and 4 more people in product and design. And so if they have this idea in their head of what those 4 jobs are already going to have to be, it's going to be hard to convince them to pull one away to do specifically design systems work, unless there's a documentation on how much doing that work piecemeal alongside the actual design is slowing people down. And so I think the most compelling argument might be right now, designers are slowed down because we have to like rebuild out part of the system every time we ship a new feature. And if you can kind of come up with like this is making each of us 30% slower over time, I think you like might be able to build up something that gets there, but people have to basically believe it's going to add more value than another person designing features. Sorry, that was a little rambly. Yeah. So I think the key is showing like how it's going to add more value to every designer on the team and how that's going to accelerate growth overall. You might also, I guess, if they are a design system designer who implements things, you could possibly try to steal that engineering from like front end engineering headcount. That's also possibly an interesting strategy.
Awesome. Thanks, Ellen. All right. What is the difference between metrics used at a startup and ones used at a giant corporation? Like, do startups focus on different metrics? This comes from Jade.
So I think there's always going to be some that people focus on. So like revenue was one I gave you. Pretty much everyone to some extent focuses on revenue. I definitely do work with really, really early stage companies that don't focus on revenue. Beyond that, I would say the most classic metrics are the idea of R metrics. So like acquisition, activation, retention, referral, revenue is a pretty common framework. NPS is another one that people use, or more often people have been calling it, it's not the mom test, that's a different thing, which I feel like is badly named. The Sean Ellis test, where they will say like what percentage of users would be really disappointed if they could no longer see this anymore. But I think across the board, metrics tend to be fairly similar. I would say the big difference is how many of them there are. I think at startups, there tend to be very few, and everyone is like laser focused around one number or maybe 3 numbers. And I think the larger an organization gets, there will be a top level corporate number that people are focused on, but each autonomous like set of teams or smaller division will have their own numbers that relate to what their actual users are doing.
Awesome. Thanks, Ellen. I see Lisa has her hand up, so I will ask you to unmute, Lisa, if you have a question. Hopefully that worked.
Oh, hi. Thank you very much. I was actually starting to type a question, but I'll just speak it then instead. Thank you so much. Fabulous presentation. I'm so floored. What I'm finding in my organization is that we don't talk so much about finance as we do about running out of time all the time. And my question is, how can we convince the PLMs to take our designs more seriously, more literally, rather than whatever the developer thinks that they think they've implemented your design, and then when you go back and give them edits and they say, well, we don't have time to implement that. Do you have any advice on how to push back so that they will implement your design revisions?
Yes. Okay. So I think one I will give you is that some of us, including me, cannot actually see small differences in things. And so I think oftentimes this isn't necessarily malicious developer choice, just so like they don't have the skill. So I think one way to try to combat that is by scoping the time up front. And so if the developer says, oh, it's going to take 2 weeks to build, making sure instead of it's 2 weeks, it's actually like 2 weeks and 2 days, where those 2 weeks are intended for like all of the polish and all of the fixes and all of the adjustments, and it's baked in. Or you can ask them to make their estimate, including the assumption that there will be minor things to come up with. I think the problem tends to come in when everyone agreed that it was 2 weeks and that like wasn't baked in from the beginning. It also kind of depends on the design. I personally would usually rather agree to cut a feature, like cut some functionality to have the higher degree of polish across the board. And so if you have more of a sense up front, you can always scope down a little bit in what the full experience will be in order to have like a higher bar for that experience. But I guess the underlying thing would be having the conversation up front with both the PLM and the developer about what their expectations are for building, and making sure that everyone knows that there probably will have to be revisions. I think everyone needs that.
Awesome. Thanks, Ellen. And from Christine in the chat, any thoughts on aligning product design with marketing design? Our marketing team owns design and brand, but has nothing to do with product, which is wild. Yeah, in parentheses. But marketing is definitely going to overshadow UX in any executive conversation. So how can we sit beside marketing at those tables? Maybe it is the same as your first point on finance.
I do think this is really tricky. It's the same. There's a common parallel with developer relations and marketing too, or like community and marketing. But I think there's a real challenge because brand design is very much like about the aesthetic and about if people want to use the thing, and has very little to do with the product, is what you're saying. My guess is that I don't know if you have a product ally who's at the table, or even an engineering technical ally sometimes who cares more about the product, and the experience can sometimes be a thing here. I think the challenge that tends to happen at that exec table is like you'll have like a CEO and then a CTO and then a VP of engineering, because most CTOs don't manage people, and then a head of product and then a head of marketing and then a head of sales and then maybe also a COO and then the general counsel. And you start to get to like a number of people where it's hard to have a conversation, which is why people become so reluctant to add another voice unless there's something specific. And so I think the thing to figure out would be, what have been the consequences of UX not being in that room, and like what choices have been made that don't actually work for UX, and then start to like show those patterns over time and figure out who the best ally to raise those in the room would be if they can't add someone. Or alternatively, talk to like I guess it could be a GM or it could be a CEO, whoever is like the higher leader in that case, to like explain that voice isn't being heard, and see what their thought is on how to get it surfaced, so like you don't run into these problems later. And I also definitely would encourage bringing it up proactively once, and then when it happens again, not bring it up in a like I told you so way, just trying to figure out how to bring it up. Yeah, not I told you so, and not confrontational, but like, oh hey, this happened again, in a like as approachable of a manner as you can, but focus on the consequences.
Awesome. Thanks, Ellen. From Kara, can you share an example of when you successfully lobbied for refocusing your efforts on more serious user problems?
Yes, this is actually one of my all-time favorite stories. When I worked at Microsoft, I worked on Office Mobile. And at the time, Windows Phone was like doing their new platform, and Microsoft had kind of an adversarial competitive culture at the time. And so Windows Phone didn't want to give too much space to Office, and Office was always lobbying for more space and what was best for Office. You had two people who are kind of thinking in silos. And in this particular one, the OneNote team wanted to have a standalone application away from Office, and the Windows Phone team wanted all of Office to be one thing. And I personally, as a user, one night pulled out my phone and yelled, "This stupid phone doesn't even have a note-taking app. I can't make a grocery list." As a person who technically worked on the team that made the note-taking app. And I found this motivational enough that I went through and I made a whole set of like user stories about things that you would want to do where you would want note-taking to be a top level action. And then I individually went around to like every designer and product and business person on the OneNote team, the Office mobile team, and the Windows Phone team, and got everyone to buy in first, and then like gave it as a talk during their crit. I wasn't supposed to be at their crit because I was a PM and not a designer, but they like let me go to the design crit and show it, and it worked. I was very happy.
That's a great example. Thank you. From Deborah, I'm new to UX UI coming from graphic design. I was wondering what you meant by hacking a design. Is it common for companies to ask you to give up design quality to satisfy financial deals? What can a designer do to avoid this?
Oh, yeah, yes. I think it's like extremely common across the board. I feel like, to someone's point about running out of time earlier, I think basically everything is, you only want something to be so good. Like you can't work on something forever. If you just like worked on making the perfect product for 10 years, you wouldn't be able to pay anyone, you wouldn't be able to hire anyone, and nothing would ever happen, and it would be quite terrible. And so you're always like thinking about, what is the balance of, I want to do it fast enough to have impact, but not so fast that it isn't good. And so I think everyone is always like walking a very delicate balance of that line. And I think executives will always kind of try to push you to the faster side of that line, hoping people will figure something out and that like constraints will build creativity. And on the other side, I think it actually is appropriate for everyone else to push back and want to add more quality and more polish. The same way engineers should always be saying, hey, we should be fixing the technical debt to be able to build faster. Designers should always be pushing the bar to some extent for quality. But I think the key is figuring out when the trade-offs make sense or not, because if you push on every single thing all of the time, no one will take you seriously. So you kind of want to figure out which of the times do you want to push on it in order to keep the bar high without losing credibility.
Awesome. Thanks, Ellen. All right, we've got a couple more minutes for any last questions that folks have. While we're waiting for any more questions in the chat, I have a question I'll throw at you, Ellen. So we, on my team at Notarize, we have a really fantastic designer who recently pulled together designs that show the vision of what the future could look like, that our CEO is able to use in his conversations with the board and so on. And there was a lot of excitement around this because design was able to really show what we can contribute. Are there other examples that you found of ways that product designers can kind of show our skills to executives and to our CEO or whoever it might be, to really get them to understand the value that we bring to the table?
That's a great one, actually. I think anytime you are showing something that will be used as part of a higher level conversation. So what gets shown at board meetings or what gets shown, I think that's a good example of like, to close prospective future deals is a good one. I think honestly, sometimes just showing people the workflow or like helping them through it as you're doing. And so like sitting down with an executive and saying like, oh, I heard you had a really good idea in this space. Can we like talk it through? And then using your skills as you talk it through with them to be like, oh, could it be like this? Oh, could it be like that? A lot of people have really great non-tangible ideas in their head, but don't necessarily know how to turn it into reality. So I think anytime you can take someone in the organization who has power and has good ideas, but doesn't know how to make it real, helping those people do that will like always make you a strong ally. And they'll feel like you're an ally. And so then they'll be more likely to advocate for you too.
Awesome. Thanks, Ellen. All right, we've got another question here from James. At what point in a designer's career would you suggest building this business acumen? How did you come to that point in your own career?
Yeah. So, okay. I don't think you need a ton of business acumen. I tried to pull out the like basic skeleton. I had enough friends call me and say like, what is ARR? People keep talking about this at all hands, that I was like, wow, it's really bad that we don't tell people what ARR is, annual recurring revenue. And so I think there's like a little bit of a baseline that can be helpful to have, just so like you have the vocabulary and you know what people are being rewarded or having an unfortunate circumstance based off of. But in terms of when to start building it, I would say there's like a point earlier in your career where the most important thing is being able to execute on tasks and the work that is given to you. But when you reach the level of seniority that you're being asked to guide the organization a little bit more or think more autonomously, so you're building products or features solo, that's the point at which having this context starts to become a lot more helpful.
Awesome. Great question. All right. Any other last burning questions for folks before we wrap things up? All right. Well, Ellen, thank you so much. This has been so incredibly valuable. And I think there's some really actionable takeaways for folks to be able to bring back to their work, hopefully tomorrow. So
yeah, if anyone
again,
does it at one of them and it works, let me know. I would be excited to hear.
Will do. Thank you so much, everyone. And thank you so much again, Ellen. It was fantastic. Please go check out the YouTube video. Once we post it on there, we'll send the slide deck out as well, so you can have access to all of Ellen's great tips. And we will see you all again soon, hopefully. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Ellen.